Okay, let's just dive right into this explainer. When we think of the great architects of the American political system, it's usually the founding fathers who immediately spring to mind, right? Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton. But today, we are exploring a guy whose legacy is honestly entirely misunderstood. We're talking about Martin Van Buren. His behind-the-scenes engineering literally shaped the way we vote, the way we campaign, and how we organize politically, even to this very day. So I want to ask you a quick question right up front. Who actually built the system of two-party competition that we completely rely on today? I mean, we kind of take for granted that our political world is divided into these massive, organized national coalitions. But that system, it didn't just appear out of thin air. It had to be constructed piece by someone who really deeply understood the nuts and bolts of political power. And while that brings us to the core paradox of Martin Van Buren, he is widely remembered by historians as, frankly, a pretty disappointing one-term president with a mixed record at best. Yet without his groundwork, politics in the United States would look vastly different. He essentially set the entire expectation for electoral competition based on opposing political parties. He was a true pioneer. All right, let's look at part one here, the master political architect. Van Buren really represented a brand new era in American history. He was born in 1782 in Columbia County, New York, making him the very first president born after the American Revolution. So he's a true child of the new republic. Plus, he was the first president not of British descent. His family was actually Dutch. And growing up, his dad was a really staunch Jeffersonian Republican, and young Martin eagerly followed right in those partisan footsteps. But he didn't just start at the top. He really had to work his way up as a lawyer, navigating this super complex world of New York state politics. At the time, New York was basically dominated by these towering historical figures like Aaron Burr and DeWitt Clinton. But Van Buren's rise was rapid and incredibly calculated. I mean, by 1812, he's in the state senate, by 1815, he's appointed the state's attorney general, and by late 1821, boom, he enters the U.S. Senate. Now, what's really fascinating is that before he even hit the national stage, Van Buren was already a total master at building political coalitions. By the time he got to the U.S. Senate, he had engineered something called the Albany Regency. And this wasn't just some casual club. No, this was an incredibly disciplined, highly organized group of politicians. He was essentially learning exactly how to align all these varied, competing interests into one unified, unbreakable voting bloc. And it didn't take long for him to take this blueprint to the national level. After backing an unsuccessful bid for William H. Crawford in 1824, Van Buren regrouped and put together this truly formidable national political coalition. In 1828, that coalition threw its massive weight behind Andrew Jackson, which absolutely helped Jackson win the presidency. This monumental feat of organization is what officially gave birth to the Democratic Party as we know it today. Moving on to Section 2, Jackson's loyal right hand. So, having helped Jackson win, Van Buren, who had actually just been elected New York's governor, was rewarded with the top job, U.S. Secretary of State. He was great at foreign relations, sure, but more importantly, he was Jackson's absolute staunchest ally. Take the Eaton affair, for example. This was a massive social scandal that was literally threatening to tear Jackson's entire administration apart. Van Buren executes this brilliant strategic maneuver. He voluntarily sacrifices his own cabinet seat. He just resigns, entirely to give Jackson the political cover he needed to clear house. And his reward for that ultimate loyalty? A diplomatic post in London, and then Jackson's vital endorsement for vice president in 1832. This move perfectly positioned Van Buren to succeed Jackson and take the presidency himself in 1836. Which brings us to Section 3, the Panic of 1837. Van Buren essentially entered the presidency intending to just smoothly continue Jackson's political agenda. But, well, the universe had other plans. The onset of the 1837 economic depression hit shortly after he took office. And this unexpected, incredibly severe financial crisis just completely derailed his agenda. Suddenly, instead of building his legacy, he's forced to spend considerable time desperately searching for any solution that would restore financial stability to a nation that was totally reeling. His ultimate, hard-fought solution to this crisis was the independent treasury. Van Buren's big idea was to house federal dollars independently, keeping them entirely away from the risks of national or state banks. But, as we know, politics is a slow, grinding game. Congress dragged its feet and wouldn't actually implement this until the very last year of his presidency, finally passing the Independent Treasury Act of 1840. Let's turn to Section 4, Enforcing Indigenous Removal. Now we have to look at the stark reality of the policies he executed just to keep his political coalition together. Continuing Jackson's deeply controversial agenda, Van Buren oversaw the forced removal of the Cherokee via the Trail of Tears. He also ruthlessly prosecuted the Second Seminole War in Florida. That was a conflict so brutal, it actually became historically known as the Bloodhound War. Domestically, he maintained a strict pro-slavery stance, specifically to retain the crucial support of white Southerners, and he deliberately deferred making any decision on the annexation of Texas. It's clear that Van Buren's time in office was heavily marked by a really strict adherence to political calculus. You can clearly contrast his actions abroad with his actions at home. For instance, when conflicts along the U.S.-Canadian border threatened a full-blown war with Great Britain, he successfully utilized diplomacy. He outright refused to be provoked into aggressive military action. Yet, domestically, when asked to assist Mormons who were seeking compensation for property they lost due to religious persecution, Van Buren looked at the math and chose to protect his own electoral chances rather than give them any support. All right, Section 5, beaten at his own game. Remember earlier when we talked about how Van Buren was the master organizer? Well, it turns out his rivals were taking notes. The Whig Party had spent years studying his playbook, and they really embraced cultural politics. We're talking catchy campaign songs like Tippecanoe and Tyler 2, massive energetic rallies, and auxiliary organizations on a national scale that even Van Buren himself hadn't fully activated yet. They took this formidable new machine and absolutely hammered the president on his weak response to the economic depression. And this right here brilliantly illustrates the ultimate irony of his career. The Whigs nominated military hero William Henry Harrison, and they successfully portrayed him as this ordinary, down-to-earth farmer who really understood everyday Americans. Meanwhile, they painted Van Buren as an out-of-touch champagne-sipping elitist living in luxury. The wild part? In reality, Harrison came from wealth, and Van Buren totally didn't. But as we know, in politics, perception often completely trumps reality. So the master political architect was ultimately defeated by false perceptions spun by the exact same kind of political machine that he helped invent. Wild, right? Let's move to our final section, Section 6, a free soil finale. So Van Buren actually went into the 1844 Democratic National Convention as the heavy favorite to win back the nomination. However, he took a surprisingly principled stance, opposing the immediate annexation of Texas into the United States. And honestly, this position completely sunk his chances. The very party he founded ended up giving the nomination to James Polk instead. Then, 4 years later in 1848, we get this totally bizarre political twist. The anti-slavery Free Soil Party actually nominated Martin Van Buren to head its ticket. Talk about a deeply odd political partnership, especially given his long history of maintaining pro-slavery stances just to keep his Democratic coalition together. Because of that massive contradiction, it was a pretty ineffective campaign. Still, it marks a genuinely fascinating final pivot in his political life. After that 1848 run, Van Buren returned to the Democratic Party, settling into the role of an elder statesman. He spent his final years enjoying retirement at his home in Kinderhook, New York. And there, with the help of his family, he focused on writing his memoirs and a really detailed study of U.S. political parties. He spent his last days reflecting on the massive system he helped build right up until his death in 1862. So, after all this, what should you really take away from this explainer? Well, we have to weigh his disappointing, depression-riddled presidential term and his extraordinarily harsh removal policies against the undeniable reality of his structural genius. The deeply entrenched, highly organized two-party system we navigate today, for better or worse, is Martin Van Buren's direct legacy. He built the machine. So does knowing that change how you view the mechanics of our modern elections? Think about that the next time you head to the ballot box.